Indian Agent by Gary Ives. Read by Gary Ives. Amos Merriweather's assignment as Badger Creek Indian Agent was a reward. 10 years after the fact, but nonetheless a reward. When he served as a cavalry captain at the Battle of Yellow Tavern, he had rescued a dismounted soldier, whom some said was no more a throne rider than a pumpkin, and was actually a panicked runaway, heading off the battlefield lickety-split for the tall cotton. But Amos had intervened. He'd seen plenty of men cut and run, most of them good men, and if the man had a lapse of courage, well, so what? The war was craziness. Let it go. The throne rider turned out to be a major, and Amos's written report, which eventually reached General Sherman, even earned the major accolades and a promotion. Now, years later, after the war, that major was a United States congressman with higher political ambitions. The congressman's vague notion that if Amos Merriweather chose to tell the true account of that incident, the congressman's political future could be damaged beyond repair. And because his political future was on the rise, he sought out Merriweather with the aim to get him as far from his congressional district as possible. Since the end of the war, Merriweather had run the livery stable in St. Joseph that he'd inherited from his father, barely managing to keep it afloat. How he hated dealing with customers. Generally city men who'd never owned a horse, who didn't know how to saddle, ride, hitch, or in any way properly tend to a mount, much less a wagon or a trap. But oh, didn't they know how to piss and moan and how to try to whittle down a bill. Horses he knew, business he didn't. The appointment the congressman assured him was his to assign. Merriweather considered the congressman's offer manna from heaven and asked no questions. A $2,000 salary as Indian agent and another $1,000 as a United States Marshal, plus a budget to take care of your redskins. You're natural for this. These Injuns, they're plenty much satisfied and pacified since they got their asses kicked back in '62 in the Dakota War. Hand out a few blankets and barrels of flour and keep them off the whiskey trail. That's about it. You'd be a fool not to jump at this, Merriweather. He agreed, and in 2 weeks received his appointment. He turned the livery stable over to his brother and headed west with his bay mare and a string of 4 pack horses. Far beyond handing out blankets, his written commission detailed responsibilities to maintain law and order, to establish schools that would educate the savage in agriculture and take steps to civilize various heathen nations within his administrative confines. The station at Badger Creek had originally been built by the Army during the war to establish stronger American presence in the Sioux Territory after the Indian uprising in Wisconsin. Afterwards, it was served as a horse buying post. Merriweather arrived in May and relieved the last military Indian agent ready to begin administration of his various heathen nations. The captain he relieved advised him where and when to look out for the French-Canadian drummer who regularly came through to trade whiskey with the tribes. Arrest that whiskey-selling rascal and your job will be a hell of a lot easier. Good Lord knows I've had a belly full of drunken Injuns. Good luck, Merriweather. Because Merriweather had been a captain himself, or maybe because they just didn't care to dismantle and load the anvils and other heavy tools of the blacksmith's forge, these tools were left behind. A month later, Merriweather struck a secret deal with Pardue, the trader, which allowed Pardue continued access to the tribes in return for a steady supply of whiskey for himself, and the caveat that he not cheat the tribes, and that he provide intelligence to Merriweather. He told Pardue, "I don't give a damn how drunk they get or what they do to each other, as long as they don't mess with the settlers or the immigrants. Your trade with them, as long as it's square, and my blankets and flour are going to help keep them happy. He'd asked him to arrange a powwow with the principal chiefs. Pardue, who had fretted about the arrival of a civilian Indian agent, was relieved. While Merriweather had little knowledge of the Sioux or other tribes, it was clear he wasn't stupid. The Sioux chiefs would want to know everything about Merriweather, and this placed Pardue in an ideal position. And that night he gave thanks to the Virgin Mother for delivering Merriweather to Badger Creek. The powwow, held next month, lasted several days and nights. Pardue and Merriweather feasted at a Hunkpapa summer camp on Elk Creek. Much whiskey, dancing, and gift-giving preceded a rash of promises from both sides, and Merriweather returned to his station with a 16-year-old Cheyenne captive and adopted daughter of Old Crowface, a generous Hunkpapa chief. For Merriweather, things couldn't have begun better. Kia, the girl, was a blessing not only to Merriweather's bed, but to the station in general. Fluent in Sioux and Cheyenne, she could communicate roughly in Comanche and French also. English came smoothly to her, and she had a knack for teaching Sioux to Merriweather. The station had a capable interpreter and was maintained as neat as a military post, but with better cooking. Kia appreciated Merriweather's sense of humor and his whiskey, and they became close. Whenever Pardue came through, he spent a couple of days at Merriweather's station. Pardue's wife was Sioux, and Mary Bigheart and Kia became good friends. Pardue always visited on his way through and left a cask of whiskey and another of rum for Merriweather. Merriweather had called on every settler within the 20-mile radius of the station. As United States Marshal for the 850-square-mile territory, he listened to the litanies of old complaints, thefts, and swindles that had occurred 20 years ago, property disputes, which he knew the only settlement to be over a grave, and numerous rustling complaints. Excepting the property disputes, most of the complaints were against Indians. In the interest of good service, he promised to look into this complaint or that as soon as he could. But when he left a homestead, he generally left the complaint behind. They all complained of the Frenchman who came down from Canada to trade whiskey for furs. Merriweather said he'd certainly look for that rascal. The one common complaint he'd heard from half a dozen settlers concerned the half-breed Slap Stone, a violent gunslinger who took whatever he wanted, be it a ham from a smokehouse or a young girl's virtue. He'd shot 3 white men and at least 3 Indians. The Sioux's complaints were as loud and as numerous as the settlers, and Merriweather decided that killing Slap Stone on sight would put out that fire and make everyone happy. He considered most homesteaders childish. Veterans and farmhands came west with big dreams of fields, orchards, herds, and flocks, but without a whit of sense about the hard work, the winters, or the Indians. More quit their homesteads than stayed, but those who stayed were tough and generally pig-headed. Settlers had 2 common complaints against the Indians: thieving and trespassing. Complaints about trespassing he ignored. Early on, he'd learned explanations about the Sioux concepts of land and hospitality were met with hostility. Merriweather never minded that the station always had a few Indian families camped a stone's throw from the flagpole. The nearest settler to the station was Jensen, a hard-headed Swede farmer. Jensen had fought the Sioux in Wisconsin War in '62 and had no use for Indians. He asked Merriweather's help to prevent the Sioux from crossing his land, as his wife was terrified by the sight of any Indian. He yelled at Merriweather, telling him he was a fool not to run them damn thieves and beg us off. He replied that this was the Indian agency, and he reckoned when Indians felt welcome, they didn't feel like burning and scalping. Swenson called him a damned Indian lover and cursed him, threatening to write the letter to the territorial governor. With the chiefs, he arranged for a yearly powwow in late August, at which he would distribute treaty gifts and where Pardue would trade. Merriweather's turning a blind eye at the whiskey and rifle trade pleased most of the chiefs. Pardue was generous towards the chiefs themselves and fair in his trades with all. Amos had become good friends with Crowface and won much favor with the Hunkpapa by shoeing their ponies at the station. If a drunk misbehaved and fought or raped, the deed was considered an Indian matter, and Merriweather's reluctance to interfere with tribal notions of justice were a linchpin in maintaining the peace. Both parties understood, however, that crimes against whites would be settled by white man's terms. Stealing had to be confronted, and when he was convinced livestock had been stolen, Merriweather went after and sometimes recovered the loss. He asked the chiefs to provide him with 3 young men to serve as Indian police. These men he armed, deputized, and paid $5 per month. Indians guilty of rustling were punished at the Indian agent's whipping post with 25 lashes, administered by one of the Indian police. Rape, arson, and murder committed on whites were understood by all as capital crimes punishable by hanging. Merriweather was thankful that he had yet to deal with a capital case. In the late summer of the 4th year passing, immigrants delivered a letter notifying Merriweather of future arrival of the missionary family who were to assist in the establishment of an Indian agricultural school at Merriweather's station. He was directed to provide assistance toward its construction and development. By now, he and Kia had 2 baby girls, and a family with children would be welcome. Within 2 weeks, the missionaries arrived aboard a wagon drawn by oxen. The Reverend Jarvis had been only 10 minutes at the station when Merriweather refused his request for Indian laborers. Jarvis asserted that he'd been assured of the Indian agent's cooperation, and if that cooperation was not forthcoming, he would report this matter to Merriweather's superiors. "Reverend Jarvis, I myself can help you some, but these people will not leave off their summer hunt just now to come help you build a cabin or church or whatever. An ox of yours ought to do you proud, and your wagons will give you good shelter until you're under a roof." The cabin was to be built on a knoll half a mile downstream from the station. Initially, he'd assisted the missionary with felling the timber for his cabin, but quickly tired of Jarvis's constant complaints, laziness, and an unwillingness to listen to good advice. Mrs. Jarvis, on the contrary, was appreciative of any assistance. Kia spent time helping the family settle in, teaching the tasks of their daily routine, fetching water, washing, cooking, etc. The women enjoyed each other's company. However, once Reverend Jarvis realized that Merriweather and she slept together, he forbade his wife to associate with the heathen fornicator. By late August, the cabin's walls were up and the door hung. One afternoon, a rider came to the station with the news of the theft of a calf from a farm on a Little Owl Creek, 100 miles away, and slapped stone the suspect. The Jarvis cabin was still without a roof. Before leaving to investigate, Merriweather advised Jarvis to work quickly to get the roof up. He offered Kia's help, which Jarvis refused. 3 days later, Merriweather arrived at Little Owl Creek. He picked up Slapstone's trail but lost him when the clever rustler backtracked in a rainstorm. Now that Slapstone knew he was being hunted, he'd be harder to corner. At the French Creek trading post, he wrote out a bill posting a $100 reward for the outlaw. When Merriweather returned to the station a week later, little progress had been made. A spread of canvas still served as a makeshift roof. He explained to Jarvis again the urgent need to get his roof finished. He would need the autumn to hunt and bring in enough meat and firewood for winter. Jarvis simply replied, "God will provide." "Damn it, man, you're looking at a cold and hungry winter. God will not cut your firewood. God will not shoot your meat for you. And since God will not shoot your damn meat, then I'm pretty sure God will not smoke the meat he isn't going to shoot for you. Now I can help you get your ridgepole up, and Key can help you miss us and you shave shakes. The help of a drunkard, a fornicator, and a blasphemer? No thank you, Mr. Merriweather. Suit yourself, you goddamn fool. Later, Amos, Merriweather, Kia, and their 2 babies left the post for a week for the powwow. Merriweather's mare had foaled that spring, and the colt was a present for Crowface. The powwow was even more festive than ever. Pardew's woman, Mary Bigheart, had also given him a son, and there was a celebration over the children. Pardew, as usual, was generous with the whiskey. Before returning to the station, Merriweather had instructed the chiefs to send riders with travois to the station for the distribution of flour, salt pork, and blankets. Crowface, naturally sanguine, was so taken with his grandchildren that he accompanied Merriweather and Kia back to the station for a visit. Upon their return, all were surprised to see that Jarvis had moved his family into the station. I told you God would provide. How unchristian it would be, Mr. Merriweather, to not share your spacious quarters this winter. I'm sorry we've had our differences this past summer, sir. His moving into the station infuriated Merriweather and presented a dilemma. Sioux custom forbade denial of hospitality, absolutely. If Crowface interpreted their eviction as a breaking of a taboo, Merriweather would lose honor, which had taken years to build, and so Merriweather resolved to do nothing until the old Sioux left. So Kia was obliged to prepare meals not only for themselves but for the Jarvis family as well. Some relief came each evening after supper, when Merriweather, Crowface, and Kia sat on the porch talking and drinking from the whiskey cask, late into the night. Crowface asked why Jarvis didn't enjoy the drinking and the storytelling. Was he sick? He wanted Jarvis to come and join us. He could see he was ill prepared for the winter, and the old Indian was taken with the little blonde girls. Crowface even asked Merriweather if he thought Jarvis would trade those little girls for meat or furs or ponies. More from a sense of humor than anything, Amos Merriweather passed Crowface's inquiry to the Reverend Jarvis the very next day. God in heaven, I cannot under any circumstances imagine anything worse than my precious girls among the devil-worshipping heathens. I curse you, Merriweather. You are undoubtedly in league with the same devils that rule these soulless savages. Curse you, Merriweather, you blackguard. When the tribe's representatives began arriving for winter rations, the nights grew noisier and stretched into the early morning hours. Drunken men lay around the station until past noon, when drinking would begin anew. Nothing delays departure like drink. Refused the loan of a horse, Reverend Jarvis walked the 7 miles to the Swede's place and begged Christian help raising his ridgepole. Jensen and his wife welcomed the company of another so disgusted with the Indian agent and his redskins. While he aided the preacher with his roof, the two commiserated on the sorry state of the Badger Creek Indian Agency. As they nailed shakes to the roof, the two men watched in disgust as Indian parties left with travois laden with beans, flour, salt horse, and blankets. Crowface left laughing with his sons to begin their band's trek south to winter camp. The missionaries were ordered to leave the station the next day. Merriweather denied the minister's request for an equal ration of flour and salt horse. These rations are treaty rations. They're for the Indian nations. The first snow fell just as Jarvis and Jensen finished the roof. The Jensens and Jarvises celebrated the move into the cabin with prayers and a haunch of venison the Swede provided. Jensen, however, became highly irritated when the minister refused his offer to trade of firewood and meat for the Jarvises' wagon and oxen. Did this preacher have no gratitude for Swenson's hospitality and his labor? The refusal broke the nascent friendship, and the angry Swede and his wife left the chilly house warming. Now the angry preacher was isolated, facing winter with insufficient food and fuel. Merriweather advised him to head back east before winter set in for the sake of his wife and his children. But the stubborn Jarvis retorted that he would rely on God's goodness, which always saw him through. God damn you, son of a bitch. Don't you realize there'll be dire consequences if you don't get your wife and the girls out of here? The first storm blew in late September. Jarvis's wife took sick. Merriweather asked the preacher to allow his sick wife to move into the station where Kia could tend her close to the stove, but the stubborn man of God would have none of it. She was dead within a week. Once again, Merriweather confronted the angry preacher. The wind was howling so that the men had to shout at one another to be heard. "Jarvis, at least let Kia care for the girls. I care not what happens to your sorry ass, but those girls need tending, man." "I'm taking them to the Swedes. They'll be tended by Christians." "You don't even know if Jensen's will take them. He was pretty mad at you last I saw. And I don't give a shit what you say, Jarvis. I'm taking those girls, at least for the winter. Now move out of my way, you crazy shit." "By God, I will kill you if you take my girls. Move, I say." Merriweather strode into the cold cabin, where the two little girls lay bundled in the same ragged quilt in which their poor mama had died. He spoke softly to them and told them he was taking them into the warm station, where Kia would fix them hot mush by a warm stove. Jarvis watched as the wind slammed shut the door of the station, his babies within, taken by this godless station master and his heathen woman. He raised his arms to heaven, beseeching God's help in their deliverance. Then, full of righteous purpose, he strode down to his cabin, where he fetched his shotgun. With a burning rage, he headed against the wind, the long gun cradled in his arms. The wind blew the brim of his hat up, and his coat-tails flapped as he stepped up to the porch, just as a voice boomed from behind. "I hear you're looking for me, Marshal." There on a gray mule sat Slap Stone with a .44 caliber rifle pointed at the preacher's chest. Jarvis swung around, raising the shotgun, and both weapons discharged in one thunderous explosion. As Merriweather threw open the door, a thick cloud of white gun smoke swirled around him. There on the porch lay Jarvis. His coat lay open, and blood spurted from the hole in his chest. The pulses diminished as the preacher's eyes glazed. Just beyond, he saw a large gray mule sniffing at the writhing frame of Slap Stone, struggling amid a froth of blood dripping from his head, trying to crawl on all fours. His face had caught the blast of the preacher's shotgun. Soon the man collapsed. The wind blew powdered snow around the body. Looking down at what resembled a hat full of crushed tomatoes, he winced and threw the mule's saddle blanket over the corpse. In the spring, the girls were allowed to choose living with Merriweather and Kia or the Jensens, and opted to stay with the station agent. That summer, they and the Merriweathers' daughters lived with Crowface at the Hunk Papa summer camp. And by autumn were comfortable speaking Siouan as they were with English. The word spread that the Indian agent, U.S. Marshal Captain Amos Merriweather, had gunned down the notorious Slap Stone, and a sigh of relief spread throughout the Badger Creek region. Amos said nothing to dispel the error of this rumor.